So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this first webinar run by Brainwaves. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Tracy. Unlike the tag that says Claire Maguire, my apologies for that. We can't seem to change it. My name is Tracy, and I'm the content manager here at Brainwaves, and I'm going to be the host for this afternoon. Before I introduce a little bit more about John, our speaker today, I just wanted to tell you a bit about Brainwaves and who we are. So Brainwaves is a global mental health and wellbeing initiative for young people, led by the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oxford, in partnership with the University of Swansea and the Day. Brainwaves aims to significantly enhance the available research data on adolescent mental health by running one of the largest ever studies involving young people in schools. We're going to use this data that we're going to collect to develop effective and evidence-based therapeutic interventions for young people. Our ultimate aim is for better prevention, treatment, and education in adolescent mental health. A large part of the Brainwaves program, therefore, is involved in education and developing a program of free mental health resources for secondary school teachers and students. So what we're doing is we're starting off by developing a course of 6 lessons for Year 12 students, but we'll then expand to build a complete program of mental health education across key stages 3, 4, and 5. The lessons are specifically intended to support critical thinking, self-awareness, and the range of skills that young people need to face mental health challenges today. So, as well as that, actually, in addition to the lessons, we'll also be doing lots of training for secondary schools to help teachers develop the skills they need to deliver mental health education in the classroom. And that's why we're here today, to kick off this first webinar in a series designed to help teachers and senior leaders understand more about mental health and education in schools. So on that line, I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. John Coleman to talk about the teenage brain and implications for mental health in schools. Hi, John.
Hello. Hi, Tracy. It's really, really nice to be here. And I have to say, it is a really exciting project. Do you know, I am continually being asked when I deliver webinars about the teen brain, you know, are these being delivered to students in school? And only this morning, I was delivering a webinar, and I was able to say, well, there is an exciting project in Oxford called Brainwaves. So I'm really, really pleased.
Fantastic. I was just going to give a quick introduction to you, John, because I first discovered John through his very good book, The Teacher and the Teenage Brain. But just a little bit more background about John. He was trained as a clinical psychologist and was formerly a senior research fellow at the University of Oxford. He's the founder of a research centre studying adolescents and their families, and was awarded an OBE for services to young people in 2001. As John just alluded to, he regularly runs training and workshops for parents and teachers of teenagers. He's written books, he's done videos and television series all around the adolescent years in the teenage brain. So it's a fantastic opportunity to listen to him today. But now let's crack on, we'll make a start. So John, what we're going to do is start by talking about the headline things, the top 5 things perhaps that teachers should know about the changes that take place in the teenage brain.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here, and I'm delighted to be able to participate in the work of Brainwaves. I'm really excited by this. So I just want to spend a few minutes just sort of giving a bit of background. I mean, I am still amazed that we simply didn't know what was happening in what is happening in the teenage brain something like 20 years ago. So in the 90s, we had no idea that there were changes going on in the teenage brain. In fact, we thought that the brain stopped developing at the end of childhood. But as a result of brain imaging, as a result of the development of scanning, we've now been able to identify the fact that there are very significant changes occurring in the teenage brain. In fact, probably the biggest changes during the life course, apart from the first 3 years. So this is really, really important. And what it means is that the teenage years are essentially a critical period, because so much is happening, so much change is happening, that the experiences that young people have, the stimulation that they receive, or the opposite, really does have a significant impact. And later on, we're going to be talking a bit more about helping young people understand more about this. But the fact is that this is a really, really important period for brain development. So what happens to the young person, both in the educational context and at home and in the community, really does make a difference. So what's happening? Well, generally, as with young people, there are both positive and perhaps not so positive things that are going on. So the first thing really is to talk about the positive things. So during this period, the brain is maturing. And what I mean by that is that the way it functions is getting more efficient. The impulses are traveling around the brain faster, but the most important thing is that the two hemispheres of the brain become better connected. So in the middle between the two hemispheres, there is a bridge, and you can actually identify the changes that occur. So if I were to show you that bridge of a 12-year-old and of a 16-year-old, you'd be amazed how much change has occurred. So the two hemispheres become more connected. That means that the young person, the individual, is able to use the capacity of the brain in a more efficient way. Now, this maturation has really big impact on the sorts of things that you in schools are dealing with. So memory improves, scientific reasoning, abstract thinking, and language improves too. So all these things are underpinned by the maturing brain. However, there are also some other things going on that create challenges. And one of the most important things is a process which is known as pruning. And what is meant by this is that effectively, in the period before adolescence, there is an upsurge of neurons, nerve cells, neurons, particularly in the grey matter, which is around the edge. You've probably heard people talk about the little grey cells. And this upsurge of an increase in neurons, and therefore in networks and connections in the brain, are actually quite difficult for the individual to manage. And so over the next few years, this process of pruning effectively means that the brain is allowing the neurons and the connections that are not being used to die away. And it's reckoned that in that grey matter, there's probably around a 15 to 70% loss of neurons during the teenage period. Now, that is really significant. It doesn't happen to all the brain, because the area in the middle, which is we call the white matter, that actually increases a little bit, but the grey matter reduces. And that, I think, is really what underlies a period of uncertainty, of confusion, difficulty in decision-making, and so on. The young person feels all over the place. They feel a bit confused at times. And that's because of this process of pruning. Now, the end result is positive. I sometimes use the phrase a leaner, meaner machine. In other words, the brain reduces the capacity, the number of connections reduces, which allows a more efficient machine. But it takes some time. And so there is a period when that's going on as well. The other thing that's important is the impact of the hormones. For you and I, there are dozens of hormones in the brain, and there is a sort of variation in level of hormones during any 24-hour period. But what's happening in the teenage brain is that variation is greater. In other words, the hormones, particularly the hormones that affect mood, well-being, anxiety levels, stress levels, and so on, are going up and down to a greater extent than they are in the adult brain. And we all know, you all know, all about the sort of flip-flop of emotions, the roller coaster that young people experience, the strange feelings they have, the catastrophic reactions to quite small challenges. All those sorts of things are absolutely common. They're an integral part of growing through these years, and understanding both the process of pruning and the hormone variation is really, really helpful. I think it's worth mentioning one particular hormone here, and that's dopamine. Dopamine is sometimes known as the reward hormone. And the important thing for teenagers is that there is more dopamine in the teenage brain than there is in at other ages. In other words, young people have more dopamine in the brain, and that pushes them to look for rewards. And this is very important because what it means is rewards are especially important for young people. And very often young people say that they get more nagging and criticism from the adult world than they get rewards. But one of the things I think that's really come out of this research on what's called reward processing in the teenage brain is underlining how important rewards are. Of course, they've got to be age appropriate, but it's quite clear that if you look at the brain in response to presenting a reward, what you find is that the teenage brain is more activated by rewards and remains activated for longer than children or adults. So this is important. The other very important hormone, well, there are lots of them, but melatonin is also important. And we'll come on to talk a little bit about sleep later, but melatonin is the hormone that makes us sleepy. And most of you will know that one of the things that we've found out as part of this new knowledge is that melatonin is released later in the teenage brain. That means it's more difficult to get to sleep. And because teenagers have to get up to go to school in the morning, it does mean that many, many young people are not getting enough sleep. But we will come to that later in the question and answer. Okay, Tracy, I think that's probably, I've sort of covered the, you know, the basic stuff, and we'll obviously talk more as we go on. So do you want to move on to some of the questions?
Yeah, well, I was just curious, John, at sort of what ages those changes take place. Are these changes the same for everyone?
Yes, that's a very good question, an important question. And actually, this is one of the areas where we've still got a lot to learn. So you would think, wouldn't you, that the changes in the brain would be linked in some way to physical puberty. But we simply don't know that yet. And I think that's one of the really important questions. We also know that these changes continue much longer than we originally thought. So particularly the area in the front of the brain, that's the prefrontal cortex, that's the area to do with thinking, reasoning, problem solving, and so on. That really doesn't fully mature until the early 20s. So it is a long period, but the biggest changes are occurring in the earlier years. I'm very concerned about our not knowing exactly when these changes start, because it is very important. And, you know, you all know that if we think about physical puberty, you can, you know, a young person can start puberty at 10, even 9. But you can also have young people who don't really start the growth spurt or other physical changes till 13 or 14. So there's a big range. And also, of course, we also know that girls are about 18 months in advance of boys. Now, this is really important. If that is happening in the brain, that will affect how young people are coping academically, how they're dealing with all the sorts of challenges that they face. But we don't know that. And for me, that's a really, really big question. And I'd like to see more research focused on that. But at the moment, we can only make a guess, really, that it's probable that the developments that I've been talking about in the brain are probably linked with physical puberty. You would think so, but we don't actually have the evidence for that.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we do know, though, that generally it is a period of quite intense upheaval and maturation, as you said. How do you think these changes affect or impact young people's mental health and life in school? What sort of effects does it have on them in a school environment?
Okay, so in a way, we have to answer that by thinking of all the positives and also all the challenges. So, I mean, I think, all the things that are in Key Stage 3, if you like, those skills that have to be developed and of course are encouraged and assisted through teaching are also occurring as a result of what's happening in here. So the development of the brain, the maturing brain, enables a lot of that teaching to be used, be utilized, and so on. So I think that the changes in the brain are enabling or making possible the sorts of learning that teachers want to see. So I think that's certainly one thing. But you've also got the fact that particularly the emotion regulation is still pretty primitive at this stage. In fact, and teachers are always saying to me, what can I do to help my students manage their meltdowns, or what do I do when a student is just losing it? And I think this is also very important because it impacts on the way young people manage the group, the way they manage the learning, and also, of course, it impacts on the stress levels. So, yeah, I think you've got the two things going on. So all the positives, but all teachers will know that there are times when students do find it very difficult to regulate those feelings, and that's completely understandable because of the things that I've been describing.
And there is a part of the brain, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce it, is it the amygdala, where this is the center of this type of emotional disruption. Are you able to go into that a little bit more?
Yes, I mean, what's happening is that the maturing brain is gradually developing networks which link different parts of the brain together, as I talked about the connectedness, but there's also on both hemispheres, those things are connected. So if you think about it, when we as adults experience stress or anxiety or whatever, we are managing those feelings through the work of this part, the prefrontal cortex. That's the part that's the sensible part, the part that allows you to take a perspective and so on. Now, those networks between the amygdala and the more, if you like, the command and control center are immature during this period. And as a result, the amygdala can overpower any sensible sort of behavior. And so, and I mentioned dopamine, I mean, where there's a reward, and it might involve some risky behavior, that's going to be very powerful during this period. So there's no doubt that the way in which the brain develops is gradually helping the young person develop emotion regulation, but it takes some time. Now, the other very important thing to say, Tracy, is, of course, there are very, very big individual differences. We haven't come on to talking about the role of the environment as well. The brain doesn't develop in like a black box, it is affected by what's going on around the individual. So the brain and the environment interact. In terms of mental health, we know that the adolescent years are the time when the great majority of mental health problems do develop. So that's one very important thing. And there is some argument that there are particular ages where there's greater vulnerability. So if you look, for example, at levels of self-harm, you will see that at between 14 and 15, you get a peak, and the same with eating disorders. So it's probable that there are periods when, not everyone, obviously, but when some individuals are particularly vulnerable. And that may be partly to do with, what's happening in the brain. I think it's highly likely. But just to emphasize, the brain and the environment interact. So what's happening in the environment affects the way in which the brain develops. And there's lots of things we can do to encourage healthy brain development. We'll come on to talk about those in a minute.
No, happy to go on to that, John. If you want, what sort of things, how does the environment, how can it affect the brain, and what sort of things can we be doing to help promote that healthy development?
Well, let me tell you a little story. When I first started delivering these workshops in Hertfordshire, there was a teacher who came to one of the very early webinars, and she just got so excited by this and went back to her school and developed an assembly around the brain. And she called it beefing up your prefrontal cortex. And I really liked that phrase. And what she was saying was, well, if the environment is affecting the way that the brain develops, there are things we can do to encourage. What we need to do is to really encourage this bit, because this bit, the more we can help that mature, the more that bit will be able to help us with emotion regulation, with planning, with problem solving, and so on. So she developed this thing called beefing up your prefrontal cortex. What does that mean in reality? Well, I think there are 4 things really that either teachers or young people themselves can do to really help this part of the brain develop. First of all, I think curiosity is really important. The more you try and push yourself, the more you explore new things, the more you develop new interests, those things inevitably are going to help that part develop. The second thing is really about how you use the internet, or how you use the digital world, particularly around gaming, but other things. The more proactive you can be, the more engaged you can be, the more you're going to get this bit engaged too. So if you're sitting there passively, just absorbing, watching a film or whatever, there's no push, there's no stimulus for that prefrontal cortex to develop. The more proactive you are, the more decision making you have to make, and so on, the better it is. And then the third thing is really about oxygen, getting oxygen to the brain. And we know that the more you are active, the more you're engaged in physical activity, but also not sitting in front of the screen for too long. That allows more oxygen to get to the brain, and that obviously helps the brain develop. Some of you will know about this move towards aerobic classrooms, which is exactly what I'm saying. The Wellcome Trust is funding a big program on aerobic classrooms, really where students are encouraged not to sit down for much more than 15 or 20 minutes at a time, and then to move around and so on. So all those things are, I think, really helpful. I think it's also, this is probably quite a good point, to say something about why actually teaching young people about brain development is so valuable. And I can only tell you that, so I developed a lesson plan, not quite as developed and complex as Brainwaves, but I developed a lesson plan mainly for Year 9 students. And so the lesson plan really covered the changes that I've talked about, particularly around memory and learning. So we did a little memory exercise and then asked them how they'd memorized it. Were they using rote learning? Were they used other types of memorization, and so on? And then about emotion, managing your emotions, particularly managing stress, and making the point that actually we can do things. We can manage our stress in different ways, and really helping them to understand they have some agency in this. And then, of course, we did an evaluation. And it was so powerful, really, because what young people say is that they have no idea about what is happening in their brains. But to know that is hugely reassuring, because they are puzzled. They don't really understand why they go on these roller coasters of emotion. They don't know why, then they think it's only them. So learning that this is what's happening to young people is incredibly helpful for them. And I think, you know, my view is that really young people deserve to be able to learn this. I mean, 30 years ago, we didn't think that it was essential to talk to young people about puberty. But now, if you said, you know, schools aren't telling students anything about puberty, you'd think, well, that's crazy. And I think it's the same with the brain. I think in 15, 20 years, of course, brainwaves is really going to make a big difference here. But hardly anyone is doing this. So brainwaves is a really pioneering project. And I really do genuinely think that young people, I believe that young people have a right to know about this. And I should add that this is also true of parents, because I do a lot of workshops for parents, and they say the same thing. Why didn't we know this before? This is a light bulb moment. Parents say to me, this will change the way I relate to young people, to my teenager, because I didn't know this. And so I just think this information is incredibly important. And I'm just so pleased that this project is taking off. But there's very little other projects, and interestingly, not in other countries. So I'm actually working in the US at the moment with educators there, and I keep asking them, is anyone doing this? And the answer is they don't think so. So I think we're pioneers here, and it's very important.
Fantastic. As John just alluded to, we are developing various lessons on both mental health, but specifically the teenage brain at Brainwaves. And we're hoping those will be ready sort of end of February, early March time. So I'll give you some details at the end about how you can keep in touch with us and move on about that. I completely agree with what John says. As a parent of a teenager, knowing this information has been life-changing in a way. John, is there any other advice you could give to teachers specifically who are, you know, working with these young people on a day-to-day basis about how they can help adjust to the changes going on in their brain? Obviously, you've said knowledge is a great thing, understanding those changes. Is there any other sort of top tips you might have?
Well, I mean, I think there are lots of things that we've learned through this new knowledge, I call it. Obviously, it's not entirely new. We've learned a lot more about cognitive development, and I think for teachers it is really helpful to know something about how working memory develops, how inhibition develops, because we absolutely need to have inhibitory skills. And one of the questions I know was about ADHD. And one of the, I think, explanations for many young people who experience this is that the process of inhibition in the brain isn't working as well as it should. So I know I'm making this very simple, but basically in the brain, there are synapses, which are tiny little gaps along the nerve fiber, that are facilitating the impulse continuing, but there are also synapses that are inhibitory. In other words, they close down the message. Now, for all of us, that's absolutely essential, because if we didn't have the inhibitory process, we would be overwhelmed with the stimuli around us. And even now, wherever you are, if you think about it, there is stuff going on outside the window. There may be other people in your room, whatever room you're in. You may be thinking about dinner tonight. You may be thinking about what happened during the day. All those things are things that get in the way of concentrating. And we have to have this inhibitory process. Otherwise, we can't learn, we can't pay attention. I sometimes use the analogy of a railway network. If you think about it, you couldn't have a railway network without signaling, right? Otherwise, the trains would just bump into each other. And the brain is very similar. You have to have a signaling process. Otherwise, the impulses just get completely muddled up. And I think what's happening with ADHD is that that inhibitory process isn't working as well as it should, which is why young people who experience this find it difficult to stay still, find it difficult to concentrate and to pay attention, because lots is coming in which they don't manage to inhibit as well as they should. So I think that understanding the importance of something like inhibition. I also think that routines really make a difference. The more young people can develop routines, that helps this prefrontal cortex, of course, and helps them develop better emotion regulation. I think the other thing that I would mention is the impact of melatonin. And I know you're going to develop a whole program on sleep. But one of the very common questions I get from teachers is, why are students drowsy in the morning? And the thing is that all of us as adults, when the melatonin is released at night, 10 o'clock or whatever, 10:30, it tells you time to go to sleep. In the morning, almost all the melatonin has disappeared from your brain. But the problem for young people is that if they've got that delay, the melatonin isn't being released till later, maybe 11:30 or whatever. In the morning, when they go to school at 8:30 or whatever, there is still melatonin left in their brains. A good study in America showed that 50% of students at 9 o'clock in the morning still had melatonin, significant amounts of melatonin in the brain. So when the students are drowsy in first and second lessons, that's the main explanation. And I think it's very important for schools to take this into account, because you know, the curriculum perhaps needs to be rethought, taking into account that there are not all, but some students aren't going to be functioning, fully functioning first thing in the morning. So that, I think, is another important thing for teachers to take on board. And one of the questions I get from teachers very often is, why are my students drowsy? Why are some of my students drowsy in the morning? Are they just not interested in the lessons? Which is understandable, of course. But actually, you know, we really do have a neurophysiological reason for this. Yeah. So that's another thing. I suppose the other thing, Tracy, I would say is, I do think understanding more about this whole process, whether it's understanding cognitive development, whether it's understanding the amygdala, as you were saying, whether it's understanding how the brain is maturing during this time, I think all that's incredibly helpful for teachers.
Great, thank you, John. We've got some amazing questions coming in, so I'm going to move on to those if we can, because we've got about 10 minutes left.
Oh, okay, so, yeah.
We'll try and do a whistle-stop answer to some of these questions, if that sounds okay.
I'll do my best.
Okay, here we go. I feel like Jeremy Paxman. Okay. Yeah, okay. One great question that we had submitted previously was, has there been any change in the recent years in the teenage brain linked to the rise of social media and mobile phones? So yes, have you got any evidence of that?
Well, there's a very famous neuroscientist in Oxford called Susan Greenfield. I think she's retired now. And she was very famous about 10 years ago because she wrote not just a book, but lots of papers about, and her argument was that screen time, which is what people were talking about then, rots the brain. And you had to limit the amount of screen time. Now, of course, that isn't the case. I think that it's very difficult to be clear as to whether social media has really impacted on the brain. And the reason for that is, of course, lots of other things are happening. We've had COVID, we've got other challenges for young people that have occurred over the last few years. I think particularly obviously more powerful, more time spent on social media, but also, you know, less support for young people. So it's very difficult to disentangle. There are some studies, and I underline some, which actually show that time spent on social media, it depends a bit what they're doing, but if it's creative, actually that can help assist brain development. Even gaming, if it's, as I was saying, if it's something creative, proactive, like Minecraft, for example, where you're building things, these things are actually positive for brain development. But I think it depends on the individual. It depends on how much time they are online, young people are online, and it depends whether they're getting enough exercise and sleep and so on. So it is a really tricky question. I don't myself think that there's enough evidence to say that social media really, has a deleterious effect on the brain. But I do think, as with all these things I've been saying to Tracy, we do have to take individual differences into account, because families are different, young people's attitudes and motivation are different, and their rate of development, physical and I think brain development, will vary. So I'm very cautious, but I don't think there's any clear evidence that social media use has really impacted brain development.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, John. That's really fascinating. We did say we'd talk a little bit more about sleep. And somebody did ask about the impact of poor sleeping patterns on the teenage brain. What sort of damage can it do to the teenage brain not to be sleeping the recommended amount?
Okay, well, one of the things that's really important and come out of, so much research recently is our learning about what actually happens during sleep. So as far as school is concerned, one of the really, really important things is that during sleep, there is a process of memory consolidation. In other words, during sleep, a lot of the learning during the day is being consolidated and cemented in fact, probably being passed from the short-term store, which is in something called the hippocampus, into the long-term store. So it's really important that young people get enough sleep, because if they don't, there isn't the possibility for that process. The other thing that, well, two other things. One is that growth hormones are released during sleep, and that's obviously very important for this age group. But the other thing that most people don't know is that what happens during sleep, well, what happens during the day is that when these neurons, these nerve fibers are firing, and it's a chemical and as well as an electrical reaction, around the neuron, a whole lot of what you might call rubbish accumulates. And at night, we have cells called glial cells, which are like little hoovers, which go around and actually recycle what's been created during the day. And this is a really important process. And the important thing is that we know if that doesn't occur, that's one of the reasons why really serious sleep deprivation, I mean, really serious, I'm not talking about young people now, but in the laboratory, where you really deprive people of sleep, they start to have hallucinations and have some psychotic episodes and so on. And that one of the reasons is that those glial cells aren't able to work properly. So all those things really matter. Now, we know that there are things that you can do to help young people get into better sleep routines, but less than 6 hours sleep a night will definitely be impacted on both learning and mood. So it is really, really important that young people get enough sleep. And if you put a teenager, a 13 or 14-year-old, into a sleep lab, they will sleep for 9.5 hours, even 10 hours. So young people need their sleep. And I think school, is clear the way we've constructed school and the timetable. I know why we do it, but it does really have an impact. There have been some attempts at delaying school start times, as some of you will know, but of course it's very difficult for schools to do that because it's not good for teachers, it's not good for parents, and most of the attempts to do that have not been successful. However, introducing sleep lessons, particularly if you engage the family, the parents as well, does seem to have an impact and does allow parents and families to help young people develop better sleep routines. So there are things you can do, but yeah, it's a very, very important, as I alluded, you've got young people with melatonin still in their brains in the morning.
It is actually 5 o'clock, but there are 2 questions in the chat which are too good to miss. So what we're going to do, apologies to anybody if you have to leave, but I am going to ask these questions, which will mean we'll run ever so slightly over. But so one question was, is there, if the research into the teenage brain appears to be consistent across different cultures and ethnicities, is there any research on that, John, that you're aware of?
Yeah, that's very, very important. I mean, one of the things I say, and I haven't had a chance to say it, that everything I've said today is agreed by all credible neuroscientists. So you can pick up any book about the teenage brain, and there have been quite a lot of books published in the last few years. One of the people I always talk about is Sarah Jane Blakemore, who's in Cambridge, very well-known neuroscientist, written a brilliant book. But anyone, any good scientist you read, so everything I've said, I haven't gone out on a limb, this is all agreed. But the question is really important. And the answer is that there isn't really any research which looks at different cultures. I think that's a terrible shame. But in a way, I think you have to accept that this is really, you know, we're in a very early stage of research. Brain laboratories, the brain imaging laboratories are expensive. And also to do the process of scanning does involve, you know, engaging young people. You have to be there for quite a long time. You have to be able to stay still. And I think scientists have been quite cautious about extending the range of samples that they look at. So most of the research, I think, is really based on sort of, if you like, standard groups of young people. But it is a big gap, of course, that we don't have enough evidence about different cultures, different ethnicities, and even on gender. I mean, people are always saying to me about male and female brains. It's still a very contentious area. I can show you research that shows that male and female brains are very, very similar and only a tiny bit of overlap, mostly overlap and only a tiny bit of difference. But then others will show you evidence that male and female brains are very different. So, you know, it's a very controversial area. And I think things like this, we really are, you know, at the beginning of quite a long journey. People also ask me about neurodiversity. How much do we know about neurodiverse brains and so on? Again, you know, yes, we know a little bit, but the problem there is that it's, you know, people have been very cautious about getting young people with, you know, send young people special educational needs and different, you know, conditions like neurodiversity into the laboratory, but also something like people being on the autistic spectrum. You've got a huge spectrum. You know, it isn't just one condition. So you get very many different experiences and behaviors of young people. So you can't just say, oh yes, anyone who's neurodiverse will have this type of, it doesn't work like that. It's much more complex. And I just want to emphasize how much we still have to learn. And I think the technology will improve, of course, make it easier. Anyway, I'm conscious.
Oh no, I was just thinking it's a fantastic link back to what we're trying to do with here at the Brainwaves program in setting up you know, a large scale cohort, you know, working with schools to research more with teenagers and involving them in mental health research. So that is the, Absolutely. You know, the very foundation of what we're trying to do here at Brainwaves. But that does actually give us a nice point to finish on, John. So thank you very much. A huge thanks to John for his time and expertise today, and what I hope has been a really useful session for you. And we'd also like to thank you for taking the time to join us today. Thank you so much. And as we've alluded to throughout the session, we've got lots of amazing plans in store here at Brainwaves, starting with the launch of our Year 12 lessons, which will be available on our website from the beginning of March. And those lessons will be on things like sleep, the teenage brain, active listening, behavioral activation, coping with stress. So we're very excited about how these lessons can be used with students and how you can use them in your teaching. And we've also got lots more webinars coming up. We're planning them monthly, and we'd be delighted if you could join us on those. We're talking about wellbeing champions and peer support, mindfulness, active listening. So I think the best way, if you're that way inclined, is to follow us on Twitter. And I'm just going to post in the chat what our website, our Twitter handle is and what our website is. We'll put this in an email as well that we follow up, and we will also be sending you a link to the recording of the webinar today if you should want to watch again or share with colleagues. So I think that's all I was going to say, actually. Sorry for overrunning slightly. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to John, and we look forward to seeing you at another webinar again soon. Thank you so much, everybody. Goodbye. Have a good evening.